Hello, friends. This is the Alphalist podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the Alphalist podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for their company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the Alphalist podcast. I am your host, Toby, and today I have a special topic, which unfortunately is a topic these days. It's downsizing, company downsizing, layoffs, etc., etc., etc. So not a very great topic, but an obvious topic for many to be busy with these days. And on the podcast today, I have Mike Fisher. And Mike Fisher used to be the CTO of Etsy. Mike, you do so many things. Maybe you quickly take the time and introduce yourself.
Yeah, Toby, thanks for having me today. And yeah, it is an unfortunate topic that we're going to talk about, but a reality for our world and something we should just address head on. So looking forward to the discussion. So my background, I was a West Point graduate. I served 7 years active duty as an aviation officer, so flying helicopters and leading troops that do that type of work. And then I really wanted to get back into technology, so I left the military and started as a software engineer at General Electric. I did that for a number of years, and I say reluctantly convinced to go back into management. And I just love the tech and always wanted to do that, but I also love the challenge of leading people. And so I became an engineering manager and then eventually made my way out to the Bay Area with PayPal in some of the early days as the VP of Eng there. And then moved all the way back across the US to New York for a startup called Quigo that did ad tech. I was the CTO there. And when that was acquired, I started a consulting company with some friends, and we focused on helping companies scale. So we met with lots and lots of startups that were going through the hyper scale phase, which was really fun work, and some of the big scale problems that companies have with millions and millions of users. So all that was really fun. And one of the wonderful companies that I met during that time was Etsy, and I met them when they were very young and growing. In the hyper phase. And I kind of, kept in touch with them throughout the years. I came back and did some consulting when they stood up their payment stack. And then eventually in 2017, when they had some leadership transition, they brought me back in and asked me if I would stay. And I said, yes, Etsy's, a company I respected. I love the mission. I love that they support creative entrepreneurs, and said yes. And that was in 2017. I ended up spending almost 6 years there, about 5.5, and just stepped down in January to spend some time with my son before he headed off to university. And all great things. Just had a wonderful time. But one of the things we'll probably get into is I stepped into Etsy, that leadership role, right after 2 rounds of layoffs.
Okay.
And so I can some firsthand experience with the challenges of recovering from that. So looking forward to the conversation. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And at the end, I actually have like a little surprise. I actually bought something from Etsy for this podcast, and happy to have that as a last question. Touch that in the last question. So you basically, like my first question is typically your nerd journey, which you almost outlined already, but you didn't tell us why you actually went from the army to software engineering. Why don't you, I don't know, fly helicopters these days? Why are you into tech and engineering?
So I my sort of nerd journey started in high school. I'm old enough that we really didn't have formal classes. We had a computer club, which I was part of, and we had these very today standards so antiquated. They were the TRS 80s, computers that came installed with BASIC. And so as part of the club, we taught ourselves how to program in BASIC. And of course, as most kids try to do, I tried to emulate all the arcade games and program games that I would love to play in the arcade. And that's what sort of fell in love. And I always think about the first time you put a pixel on the screen or have it move or do something, and you're just amazed that like my lines of code did that. And I was hooked at that point. And I knew I wanted to be an engineer, but I wasn't sure what type of engineer when I went to to West Point. And I didn't even think of computer science. I thought of the more standard electrical, aeronautical. And then we were the first class at West Point to receive computers, personal computers. Before that, it was all work in labs. And that forced everybody to take a programming class. And I realized that, oh yeah, this is something I could study and do professionally. So that's what convinced me immediately that first semester become a computer science major. I loved it. It was that type of work that I would want to do everything else just so I could get to my programming assignments. And I liked it so much that even in the military, when I was active duty, I went back and did grad school just so I could continue to program. And so I always had this super passion for programming, even though, as I mentioned, I went into management. I've continued to program with side projects and things, and I do that still today. It's just been something that's super passion of mine. As much as I did love flying and I love the mission in the military, ultimately, wanting to program and be around tech won out. And I've loved it. It's been a great career.
Okay. Then I'm glad that you made the jump. So can you maybe share a bit more of your experience at Etsy and the time you did layoffs and why and how it kind of influenced your day-to-day in your life?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I joined right after the 2 rounds of layoffs in 2017. Mm-hmm. I was actually they brought me back in as a consultant during those final days right before they executed that. But I joined shortly after that, and I felt all of the ramifications of that. And I think there was a number of them. There was a huge emotional challenge that the team had who were left behind to pick it up. So you've got, this was a very, as most companies are, very close-knit. A lot of people had really bonded and formed, great friendships. And to have some of their friends have to leave was really, really tough. So I think the emotional side of this was really tough. The other side is, of course, now people have to pick up the work. And pick up the work in terms of not having easy transitions. Normally if it's someone's departing, you can have longer transitions. This was a much faster transition. So people were really trying to pick up the work and doing the work of 2 or 3
in the US, you basically are immediately out normally, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. So there wasn't a real period in which they could transition. So the knowledge transfer was tough as well. And I just remember people literally going around looking through desks trying to find, I remember one case of like, where were all the contracts that someone had been managing? And that type of stuff, when you sort of usher people out the building, it's just kind of, left a bit in chaos. And, to the credit of the people that were left behind, they did that and picked up the pieces and were able to get it going. But, the work was one, the emotional was one. And then the probably the third piece, we could talk more about any of these. The third piece was then other people left. So you get the round of layoffs done, and you're at a whatever number that the company wanted to be at, and then you start having to deal with super high attrition, which we did. And because people are very worried about that, or they're upset, and all those are reasons that people look to leave. So that the attrition rate was also something that we had to face every day for months afterwards.
Especially in areas where you easily find a new job, right? Like engineering. I mean, even back then, it was already the time when the golden times, right? Then
that's right.
You think twice if you want to stay with such a company.
That's right. There's almost, at least in the U.S. and almost worldwide, there's almost, zero unemployment for engineers. Mm-hmm. Even the last rounds that we saw, this past year, I think people were, landed very, very quickly into other roles. As other companies, we could talk about how they saw opportunities in that when companies, like Twitter laid off a bunch of people and Meta saw an opportunity to grab a bunch of engineers and stand up threads it's really tough to keep people in an environment like that when they know they can go other places.
And I guess then you also had to face lots of technical debt in terms of, I don't know how diverse the Etsy stack is. You can tell us a bit more about the stack, but most likely you had like various open ends, right?
Oh, absolutely. I told a little anecdote about people looking for contracts in desk, but of course the technical knowledge walks out the door as well.
Yeah.
And that's super challenging. One of the things that probably benefited us is Etsy is generally a monolith for the primary marketplace. Right, which actually helped in this case. There's some benefits to as many challenges as there are in scaling a monolith. There's also some benefits in terms of knowledge that people have and not having to learn, a brand new stack in a different service. We do have major chunks of the marketplace split out into services. So, it's not a true monolith in that, we've got a separate stack for search, a separate stack for payments and things like that. But a lot of the marketplace is a monolith. And so we were able to benefit from that. But even that, there's, of course, specialty knowledge that just walks out the door.
Out of curiosity, what's the tech stack of Etsy?
Yeah. So we're a PHP shop
Okay.
and have been, for many, many years. And that's, we have learned how to scale that very, very effectively. As you would imagine, with 100 million items and millions and millions of buyers that and the site performs, it's very performant and highly available, which the team just has done a wonderful job and learned how to do that over the years. So,
and I guess that was still all bare metal, etc. Or
so that was one of the challenges. We were in data centers, bare metal. We managed all of that ourselves. And one of the things that I looked at, given that I landed right after the layoffs and fewer people, was how could we spend less of our engineering effort on managing that infrastructure? And so one of the major initiatives that we kicked off that summer, a couple of months after the layoffs, was the migration to the cloud.
Wow.
And that began, we did a couple months of, the RFPs and the assessments of different cloud providers. Ultimately chose Google in December of that year of 2017 and began January 2018, the migration. I thought we had planned on taking a year for the main marketplace to migrate. That was going to be the first really large piece of functionality. And that, this is again, just kudos to the resilience and the amazing engineering talent at Etsy that even after the layoffs, after losing a bunch of people through attrition, started in January, we thought it was going to take a year. They came back to me after a couple of months and said we could do it by August. And that was a really big deal because if we could do it by August, we didn't have to buy a bunch of other bare metal to stand up in the data centers to get us through the holiday season that year, which I thought we were going to. And so the team did this, really incredible push and launched us on GCP in August of 2018. It saved us millions of dollars in hardware costs, and they never looked back. So, it just shows that they could do some great things, when even through all that adversity.
Mm-hmm. So you moved to Kubernetes straight away then, or?
So we did. So I mentioned there's a split between, the marketplace, which is the PHP stack, and our search stack, and we migrated two different ways, which is an interesting sort of comparison. The Etsy marketplace PHP stack we lifted and shifted. So we lifted it and put it straight onto VMs, and we did that really because we didn't want to have to learn how to productionize and run the marketplace in containers. And we thought that was a lot of debate about it, but ultimately that was the decision. And so we lifted and shifted the marketplace, but the search stack we did differently. We actually migrated that to Kubernetes first, and then we migrated to the cloud onto GKE. And it allowed us to sort of compare. I would say at a very high level, the big difference was that it took us probably a good year to learn how to really operate search in containers. There's a lot of complexities to that. And to manage that well. And the major metric there is availability. And we monitor availability monthly and report on it and so forth. And you could see from that metric that we had to learn quite a bit. Compared to the Etsy marketplace, which we knew how to run on VMs. And so that was an easy transition. The difference, though, was that, as you would expect, the search was completely cloud native. So it could immediately take advantage of all the things like auto scaling and so forth. And that was a huge benefit. Whereas we had a lot of work to do on the marketplace to be able to take advantage of the cloud, the benefits in the cloud. And so that's the real trade-offs. I don't think there's a right or wrong, like most tech things, there's not a right or wrong answer. But in this case, there's just pros and cons. And so there was this, the pros of lifting and shifting is how to operate that. The cons are you're not very cloud native, and you've got a lot. You can't take advantage of it.
Yeah. I can imagine. But it's also good to do one by one, right? To first go with search or one piece, and then really move that over and really learn how to operate it. Also, back then, Kubernetes was still quite young, so I think it's quite an adventure then. And I can imagine that actually for the team that was left, I don't know how big was the shrink in the dev team? Like how many people did leave, and how big was the team then afterwards?
Yeah, I think they laid off probably close to 20% of the engineers. We were down to about 350 engineers at that time. I think that was the lowest mark that we hit. And that was even through some of the attrition. And we talked about like the emotional part of it. I actually think a major project like that helped reinvigorate and get the team over.
That's what I mean. You have a new mission, right? Like a totally new thing. Like the old team was not, or the old people were not involved at all. There's no legacy. You have like a greenfield, right? And
it is. I think engineers love to ship. They love to ship code, push, and get stuff done. And I think giving them a big project that was exciting, we had to learn, all of us had to learn about GCP. And so all their services and how to manage them and that. So you're getting your engineers distracted by new technology that they've got to learn. You're giving them a big, audacious goal of this, this interesting project. I think all of that helped in the healing part. Yeah,
can imagine. And was there a moment, like you recently wrote a blog article in your Substack on downsizing? That's why we also picked up the topic. Did you have like an aha moment? Like you have a very, let's say, straight opinion on downsizing, that it's not good and that it doesn't make sense in most cases. What was your aha moment?
Yeah, I think watching that, and I also should say that, I mentioned that I started my career at General Electric in the sort of late 90s, the very end of the Jack Welch era. And they did layoffs, almost on a yearly sort of basis. And so I saw that early in my career. And then, of course, stepping into Etsy right after their layoffs, I saw this, that, I realized that it is incredibly disruptive, even to the engineers that are left behind. And it takes, it took us, I really want to say, a solid 9 months to get through that emotionally and get us back to the level of sort of engineering that we were before with the remaining engineers. And, I've even seen this not through layoffs, but through, we track what the impact is to team changes. And, it's kind of another little anecdote. In our very, small study, what we saw was that if you take a fully formed squad and you give them a new initiative, a new mission that they're, goal that they're working on, they need to reset about 6 weeks. So it takes them, if they're working at a certain velocity, whether you measure that through whatever, we could talk about the challenges of measuring that productivity, but at some velocity, it takes you 6 weeks to get back to that if you just give them a new mission. And the reason, you think through that of like, well, yeah, they've got to realign their goals, they got to, do a new discovery part. Like there's so much that they've got to reset. But if you actually change the team makeup, if you pull a couple engineers out, you rotate people in, you actually lose about 12 weeks from what we saw. And so if you think about like, a reduction in force or layoff or something, you're losing an awful lot of time. I would argue it's well past even the 12 weeks. It's probably closer to, 24 weeks or close to 6 months worth of, you're going to be working your way back into that. So it's a lot of lost productivity. So I watched that happen, at Etsy and of course at G and other places. And I realized that if your goal is, of course, if the company needs to cut expenses because they've got to get to a point where they can survive, they're either not profitable or they don't want to have to raise another round of funding or something like that, then they've got to do what they've got to do. And so I don't begrudge them that, but you can't expect to cut these individuals and cut the cost and simultaneously grow. That is I just don't see that as a possibility. You have to expect you're going to have a certain period in which you're going to have a huge reset, in part because people have to figure out, again, they have to pick up other people's jobs. They're emotionally struggling with this, that they've seen their friends. So, and you have just fewer people. And so that was the real point of that blog post is you cannot expect to cut cost and grow. It's just really not going to happen. So if you're focused on growth, which a lot of companies are and should be, then trying to cut costs simultaneously is kind of a losing proposition in my opinion.
But doesn't it like absolutely depend on the amount of people you cut? Like if you cut, let's say 30%, then this absolutely applies, I would say. But what if you cut like 10% or you cut strategically in areas which were never profitable? Let's say you did internationalization and it just didn't work out, and then you just decide, okay, we stop internationalization. Then obviously you influence the other people as well. If you let go, let's say your internationalization team, your German team, for example, if you're from the US, but you think it still influenced the org in total?
I do. I think there's a culture, there's friendships, there's a lot. Even if it's an isolated team, I think there's impact there, and I think you should expect that. So even if it's a like you said, it's an initiative that didn't work out, I think stopping that and pivoting people, and I think this goes into people, I my sort of opinion about employees and people is like they want to give their all and really believe and buy into the company and give that, but they also want the company to do that back to them. And I think you see these stories of people where when the company has treated them really well and fairly, then people want to be there for the company and give the extra. And if the company's quick to sort of let people go because something didn't work out and is not willing to, retrain or move them to a new initiative or try something else, then I think that impacts not only the people that obviously let go, I think it impacts everybody in the company. They see that and they watch how the company treats employees.
I can imagine. If I'm now a CTO of a growth-oriented company and like in the leadership meeting, like we discussed that it's not going so well, and we have to reduce some people. Like it's our only chance. What would be your advice for me? Like if I'm an engineering leader,
if you really have to, I think you need to set the expectations about how long it's going to take to recover, both from an emotional as well as a productivity. I think that would be one of the things. And then I think, of course, it's important how you treat people. I think one of the other things that I'm a pretty big believer in is being as open and honest with the team as possible. I think that really carries a lot of weight. And the more you do behind closed doors and in secrecy, and you don't explain why you did this to the company, the worse it is. So if you've got to do this, my advice would be prepare, for a huge hit to productivity for quite a while afterwards, and also prepare to be as open and transparent as possible about the rationale of why you did it, why this was necessary to keep the company going, or whatever your rationale is, because people will appreciate it, and it helps them emotionally, sort of understand this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think the most popular downsizing example in the recent, let's say, 2 years is Tritter or X, as some people might refer to it now. What is your view on that? I mean, they let go almost half of the people, and their revenue also dropped by 50% or something. You think it's directly linked, or?
I think that if it's not directly, there's a strong correlation there. I think what we've seen from some of the articles is lower availability. And one of my sort of adages is that availability is your most important feature. And what I mean by that is that you spend a lot of your engineering effort on building new features, which is great because we need to build new stuff and keep up with demand and provide for our buyers and consumers. But your new feature is never going to make as much money for the company as just keeping the site available. And this is why it's the availability and all the infrastructure and SRE and DevOps personnel are really important. So I think, if you look at just availability hit that they took from letting go of some of the teams, that's certainly part of the reason. I also think advertisers, which is Twitter's main revenue source, look at how they treated people. And brands know that, as I was talking about, employees care how you treat other employees. Even if they have to be let go, even if they have, for whatever reason, whether it's performance or just cost cutting, employees look at that and care. And I think other brands care. And so when you do something publicly and you don't treat people very well on the way out, I think it really hurts. So not only is it an impact on the engineering team, as I mentioned, loss in productivity, probably loss in availability, and not a huge loss in knowledge. We'll get to that in 1 second. But it's also a reputation risk if you don't do it well. And I think that was a huge hit for them. The knowledge piece, I mentioned sort of in the beginning of our session that a company like Twitter that let go of thousands of engineers, other companies were able to grab them up, like Meta, and build a competing product with Threads. And I don't know if Threads is going to be successful, but you open up the door for challenges like that when you do really, really large rounds of layoffs. Other companies see this as opportunities. And I think that's what happened here. So for many, many reasons, I think that was very harmful for Twitter. Now, we'll see if they can recover. I hope for everybody left there and that they can. But I think all of these ramifications that we're seeing this year were caused by that. That's kind of the core.
Funny enough, stock prices often seem to rise after layoff announcements because company is then theoretically more profitable. But it's not a long-term thing. You say
it's not a long-term.
Yeah,
I agree. I think you do see a lot of people, stock price jumps, but I think that's very short-term thinking. Unfortunately, a lot of the markets are driven with very short-term thinking. We've, in part, I've written about this before a little bit, that in part it's because of our quarterly reporting. And so that focus, it really requires company CEOs and executives to think in very, very short term. That if you're not producing results this quarter, it's really hard. You've got to tell the story to the analyst, and to the market over and over about why you need to invest for a longer term, and why it's best. That's a challenging position for executives, no doubt. So we've got, I'm also a believer in systems drive people's behavior. And, it's not that someone's, really trying to be nefarious or not a great leader or whatever, but like we've got these systems in place, things like quarterly reporting that drive people's behaviors. We see these systems all the time that impact how people behave, how people perform, decisions they make. And, it's not, it's not the individuals, it's really that we've got all these processes in place and systems that force them into this. And it's unfortunate, but I think it's very, very short-term thinking.
So that sounds as if you're like a big believer in OKRs and quarterly goal planning.
Yeah, I do believe in goals, absolutely. Whether you use OKRs or some other framework, but I think you've got to plan on longer-term initiatives. I believe the way we sort of think about what I've talked about is a portfolio management. So just like you would portfolio manage your investments, I think you should be portfolio managing your projects. And some of your projects you should expect to have really, really quick hits and wins within the quarter, but you've also got to be placing these longer bets.
Yeah.
And if you're not, you're just optimizing. I often use Kent Beck has this framework he calls 3X. And it's the different phases that companies and or products go through in the life cycle. And the first is that exploration phase where you're just exploring, and trying to find product market fit, your 0 to 1, whatever you want to call it. Once you find it, you start scaling up. And really extracting the value and scaling. And that's that hyper growth phase often in companies. And then eventually that levels off, and that kind of S curve becomes, you just kind of, continue to gain value, but it's not as much high growth. And, I think using that framework, you've got to think about what do I have in each of those phases from a product perspective. And some of them are, again, going to be short term. I'm just optimizing stuff. I'm tweaking some, final layouts and, spacing, and all of that really does matter. But you've also got to be putting stuff in the buckets of exploring and trying to find new product market fits. So, we can have OKRs, we can have short-term goals, but we also need to be thinking long-term as well.
Okay, so that was just a little detour. You also mentioned in your blog post that R&D intensive industries suffer more from downsizing. Why is that?
Well, I think because that knowledge loss. There's, as you grow a company, we go from, if you think about the small startup, a lot of people are generalist because it's all hands on deck. Everybody's got to kind of do everything. But as you grow, you start to become specialized because you can afford to. It's more economic. It's beneficial. I kind of use the example, like if you and I were the only two developers in a startup and our dev environments had a problem, we've got to fix them. Whether we're very good at that or not, we've got to. Like, it's just got to get done. But if we were two engineers in a 1,000-person engineering org, we'd probably have somebody who specializes in this and can help us because they know really what they're doing. You and I might struggle with that. They might know it in 2 minutes. So the specialization makes total sense. But the problem with that is when you start laying people off, you're not laying off generalists generally. You're starting to lay off specialists because these are bigger orgs. And when you do that, you start losing that knowledge. And then people have to step in, regain it. So that's why I think companies that are very heavily focused on R&D, really, it impacts them much more.
I think one mistake looking at the layoffs waves is often that you could also start earlier to be a bit frugal, right? Or a bit more frugal than you are. Is that maybe sometimes even an alternative to layoffs? I don't know. Cloud costs not being optimized, a lot of SaaS tools flying around. Do you have tips for that? Like how to become more of a bootstrapper and frugal?
Yeah, 100%. And I do give credit to companies like Etsy, post 2017, who've really tried to do, I would think of as more sustained growth. It's not a growth at all cost, and I agree that you can, being more frugal with that and being a little more conservative make a whole lot more sense. And it's Yeah, it's a case of if you do this and we're more thoughtful about this, but still with a growth mindset, then hopefully, we know that the economy cycles, right? It's not a surprise. It's done it, as long as we've measured it. And so going through some tough times should absolutely be expected. And so again, instead of thinking about the short term of like, oh, I'm going to grow for this quarter because it's going to look great in my earnings report or whatever, thinking about this long term. Okay, I'm going to grow and that's going to be great for the company, but I also know that there's a downturn coming at some point. And so be prepared for that and grow at the right pace. I think that is, again, an example of like companies that really have better long-term thinking don't have to go through this short-term up and down as hard as others.
As heavy as others, right? Like if you look at like SaaS, for example, where they like people or companies were like blown with people, like hundreds of people, even if they just had like a few millions in ARR, and then all of a sudden you had to hit the brake, and and it's, I mean, it's foreseeable, right? Like it all kind of follows the cost of money, right? That's what we see these days, right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
But like, do you have, like, if you act as CTO, do you have do you constantly look at your cloud cost, like as an example, or?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, we have at Etsy, I'm sure lots of other companies, a FinOps team within engineering that's their 100% full-time focus is cloud cost. And they're used in a couple of ways. One, as experts. And so when a team wants to stand up a new service or explore using something, they can go to that team and ask about the cost and how they could do it, how they can design something in a more cost-effective way. So that's a great use of them, just to preempt any sort of spikes. And the other is just watching. I know you've seen companies and heard stories about people who the cost just skyrocket out of control. They're not paying attention. And so this is a group of folks that can pay, really, really good attention to the cost. And if they see something, they can get into that and find out which team owns that and stop it before it becomes a big problem. And then, the final would be challenges. They usually get challenges of like trying to cut cost a certain amount each year. And so, if they're not guiding teams or monitoring, they can also be working on thinking about strategies and whether that's, some sort of data cleanup or optimizations or something like that. So absolutely, teams need to be thinking about, somebody's job needs to be looking at the cost of your cloud and monitoring that and be an expert in it. It really matters. And it's complicated, as you know. The invoices can get very complicated in trying to diagnose what the real cost is. So having someone that knows that is very, very valuable.
Okay, so rather get that earlier than later, I guess.
Yes.
At which size would you say, like engineering team wise, you would build a FinOps team? Is that before security or after?
That's a great question. Obviously, security, especially nowadays, is so very important. When we're seeing more and more cyber attacks, and generative AI is just going to ramp that up even more. I was listening to a panel yesterday from some chief information security officers that were talking about that and the impact of AI on security. So it's a big deal. It always has been. It's going to be even more and more difficult to defend against this. So security is, probably still very, very top, but FinOps and somebody focused on that is a close second.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Yeah. So very good insights. I told you about that a crazy thing I bought for my outro question. I have it here in my hand. Like, people can't see it because we're not recording video. It's a crazy device that I bought on Etsy. It's I just searched for time machine. I don't know if you can imagine what it might do. And I tried it out. It's actually working. I'm a bit younger today than yesterday. I want to try it out with you. And I switched it on. can easily like enter your name and a year I want to travel to. And let's imagine I type it in like year 1996, Mike Fisher, and you were back then like just finished with the army and starting as engineering manager at GE. And now we observe yourself for a while. You're still like in helicopter mode, etc. and you have the chance to now whisper something into young Mike Fisher's ears. What would it be?
Yeah. I love the time machine that you bought off of Etsy. I could tell you some of my favorite purchases. But if I were talking to myself back in 1996, I think the thing that I didn't do, I did not keep up with my network. And, even before that with professors and colleagues. And I think that's really important. I now say that tech is 1 degree of separation. So within one person, you almost know everybody in tech, especially when you sort of put it in metro areas. New York City, super, super highly connected within tech. I'm sure there's lots of other places around the world that are that way. And even of course across, there's there's a lot of that connectivity. And I think it's really important. Because, not only because the network provides you with opportunities, but it also provides you with information and knowledge. And one of the things that I've noticed when, people go into companies, that you often bring, an outside perspective, but you lose that pretty quickly. And you start only thinking about things the way the company does. And so you get very internalized in terms of, this is how we do it here. And your network, what that can do is, if you continue to leverage this, it can give you a perspective from the outside. You can hear about what your friends are thinking. Things like this podcast, are great resources to keep up with people, listen to your friends and what they're talking about. And I think that's really important. Is don't be so focused on yourself. And, I know we all love the tech. That's why we're in here. But like, lift up from the keyboard every once in a while, listen to a podcast, connect with a colleague, talk to someone. These are important. These are more important than you think. And so that would be my advice that I would give myself back in 96.
Thanks a lot. I also see there's like a huge trend in the CTO world to become more of like CPTO and understand better what the environment is, and also talk to people more. It's like
Yes.
Not only your engineering team. Thanks a lot, Mike. It was a great discussion.
Toby, thank you so much for having me.
Have a great day. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Toby.
Bye.
You too. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Alphalist podcast. If you liked this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about, or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. Alphalist is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to CTO@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on Alphalist, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.